Thank you, musicians. Thank you, Mozart. Some birthdays inspire people to think more than other birthdays do. It depends on the age, I guess. Round numbers, especially. I hit a good round number in September, 80, 80. Oof. I used to think 80 was a big number. Old, very old. Now it doesn't seem so old to me. I remember what May Sarton wrote in her journal on her 70th birthday. Quote, I do not feel old at all, not as much a survivor as a person still on her way. I suppose real old age begins when one looks backward rather than forward. But I look forward with joy to the years ahead, and especially to the surprises that any day may bring. I agree with that, though some of this year's surprises did not bring me joy. So I'm not old yet, but I have been around for 80 years. Perhaps I have learned something worthwhile. What wisdom, if any, do I have to share? 80 is one significant age. I'll mention some other ones that are commonly thought of as significant. 6, you usually start first grade. 13, you're a teenager. 16, you can get a driver's license in Maryland, and it's also the age of consent. At 18, you can vote and sort of be an adult. You can buy tobacco, but not alcohol. You can join the army without permission from your parents. At 21, you can buy alcohol and you are officially adult for all legal purposes. Are you grown up? Not usually, not most of them. 35 is a new significant age. You are no longer a young adult. At 40, you are protected under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, 1967. At 50, you can join AARP. At 62, you can take Social Security. At 65, Medicare. And 70 is the biblical 70. And now I'm 80. So, and as we all know, there are two aspects of growing up. Growing taller, maturing physically. This is usually over by the late teens or early 20s for men, earlier for women. And the second is growing wiser, maturing mentally. This should never end. In our early years, we tend to lump these two together. Later on, when we stop growing taller, we may grow wider and eventually shorter. We stop thinking of this as growing up, and we just apply growing up to kids. And we also usually stop thinking about the other aspect of growing up, maturing, getting wiser, whatever we call it. With kids, we sometimes ask them, what are you going to be when you grow up? It's mostly for our own amusement, but we do it. They might answer teacher, football star, mommy, doctor. We don't ask them, what are you going to do when you grow up? But that's the answer we get. Kids don't know the difference, but we know the difference. Even as an adult, so one of our standard lines for breaking the ice with new people is, what do you do? As some of you know, a long time ago, I got a PhD in physics and was employed as a physicist. Our daughter also became a physics major in college. I didn't try to influence her to do it, except by trying to set a good example. And she pointed out to me a difference that I had never thought about. But after she said it, I realized it was true. In her words, some of her fellow physics majors were physics jocks. They lived for physics. Others, including both of us, didn't live for physics. It is and was just a pleasant, interesting, challenging, moderately well-paying occupation. The same can hold true for other occupations, of course. You may remember former President Clinton's much maligned remark, "It all depends on what the meaning of is." If I say I am a physicist, I could mean two different things. I could mean, as in my case, that I am qualified to be a physicist and have or once had a job as a physicist. It could mean, as it didn't mean for me, that my identity is as a physicist. Am I a physicist? It depends on what the meaning of am is. Are you defined by your job? What happens when your job goes away? As does, for example, the job of child rearing, when your children get old enough, or so you hope. What happens when you retire? What are you then? Is that a grown-up way to behave? Let's think about being grown up. If you tell me to grow up, you mean that as an insult. You don't mean that I should get taller. You mean that I'm behaving childishly. And all of us are fortunate, at least those who are not from faraway states like our two children. We live near Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. We get to see lots of bad examples. We get to see the highest levels of all three branches of the government. And if you read the newspapers, you'll see bad examples in other areas, including sports, business, and entertainment. As I think of some of the characteristics of being childish and immature, you will very likely be able to think of examples. And I hope none of these reminds you of yourself. Childish behavior. Newborn babies are totally and entirely self-centered. Other people are only important for what they can do for me. Normal for babies, bad for adults. People with childish behavior want privileges, but not responsibility. When something goes wrong, they blame others. They do not feel accountable for their actions, and they never admit making mistakes. Rules, laws, they're for other people. Decisions they make are based on what they want to happen, not reality. They are quite capable of denying reality. Delayed gratification is bad. They want what they want now. And as long as we're thinking about government types, here's a couple that don't usually apply to children, but do indicate immature behavior. They want power for what they can get out of it, not for what good they can do. Their beliefs are the correct ones, and they want to impose those beliefs on others. They think their actions are fine, as long as they're not caught, or not indicted, or not convicted, and maybe even then. And they believe that being famous, becoming famous, or making money are ends in themselves. One example from the dim and distant past, 1974, the Watergate cover-up. President Nixon, soon to be ex-president, made the classic remark, "Mistakes were made." That was as close as he could come to admitting mistakes. So what happens as we grow up? Not just the physical aspects, but the rest of it. First, we have to learn how to adjust our behavior to conform to our society, to become a well-integrated person in that culture. There are rules and regulations and customs, unspoken assumptions we have to learn. These vary from culture to culture. Every culture has implicit goals that are expected of most people, like making money or getting married or obeying the precepts of your religion. This takes a lot of years, maybe 21 or 35. Not everyone gets past this. Being grown up doesn't mean we can stop learning new stuff and just carry on passively. Not even if we're so grown up we are senior citizens. If this is what you do, if your learning is limited to new bits of trivia from Jeopardy, you've stopped being grown up. You've regressed. But being grown up doesn't mean we should be serious all the time. We don't have to be like the Puritans, who didn't believe in having a good time, ever. That was sinful. But being grown up does mean you have to take responsibility for your actions. And being grown up does mean that you have to be realistic about life. I remember a fine example from the comic strip Hagar the Horrible. He said, "When I was young, I wanted fame and fortune. Now that I'm more mature, I realize you have to compromise. Now I just want fortune." It's much more pleasant being in the auditorium or the worship hall where I can see more faces than, but I do enjoy seeing those of you who have your cameras on. Thanks. All right, then what? As grown-ups, we could possibly turn our attention to living the good life. Living the good life. That means accumulating lots of possessions, right? The one who dies with the most toys wins? No, we know better than that. Living the good life has nothing to do with being wealthy. So wealthy we can buy a mansion in Potomac and have 6 BMWs in our garage. There are, of course, lots of people in this area who haven't figured that out. But being grown up, part of it is planning ahead. Financial advisors tell us to have a long-range financial plan. Businesses have long-range plans. UUCR has a future planning team. Often 5 years is the time period used. Perhaps because 5 years is as long as it seems reasonable to plan ahead. Perhaps because we have 5 fingers on our hand. Perhaps it's because of the tradition started in 1928 by Joseph Stalin. Well, if you're still raising children these days with the pandemic, virtual schooling, do you still have time to think about the future? I hope so. Try to. But for most of us, 5 years isn't long enough. Do you have a long-range plan for your life? Or do you just take it a day at a time, accepting what comes along, making minor short-term changes as you need to? What do you think would be a reasonable 5-year plan for you? What would be a reasonable goal? How would you define success? Now suppose that you're all grown up physically, mentally, socially adapted, well-adjusted member of society. Things are going well. You have outgrown your childish ways, as Paul said in Corinthians. You've outgrown some of the misconceptions and prejudices that were instilled into you in your childhood. Are you all done growing up? Well, you recognize that that is a rhetorical question with the obvious answer, no. After we are established, financially secure, or sort of, we can continue to grow up. When we know how to get along in society, we are free to examine the choices we've made and those that have been made for us, and decide how we want to live the rest of our lives. We can learn to question, analyze, change. need to learn to think for ourselves. Most youth probably have already started. Many, probably most of us, are not active in the religion that we grow up in, the one that was imposed on us by our parents and those around us. We can decide what's important for us, devise our own reasons for living, look for what's fulfilling for ourselves. For traditional Christians, Christianity, of course, is what Unitarian Universalists grew out of. The goal in life is to achieve salvation and eternal life in heaven. That is long-term planning, infinity, but it's not the goal for most of us. If you had no constraints, if you were free to do anything, what would you do? How would you use your life? There are at least as many answers to these questions as there are people, but you might consider some of these. You might consider, for example, living a contemplative life, perhaps with the goal of achieving enlightenment, capital E. You might consider working to alleviate injustice in the world. There are too many possibilities. You might consider learning for its own